Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 86, Wednesday, January 18th, 2023.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined as always by the pencil to my paper, my lovely co-host, Emily.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, listeners. Welcome to season 6. Really excited to start off this new season with an author interview.
Yes, our first selection of the year is Drawn to Greatness, Disney's Animation Renaissance by Michael Lyons, who we are delighted to have join us today. We were first introduced to Michael as one-third of the co-hosts of one of our personal favorite podcasts, Disorder. And Michael is also the co-host of From Pencils to Pixels, the Animation Celebration podcast. His contributions to both of these shows are aided by his wealth of experience as a freelance writer specializing in film, television, and pop culture. Welcome, Michael.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk Disney and Disney history with both of you. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Like we said, Courtney and I have been listening to you on Disorder and following you on social media now for years. And we were so excited when your book released because we immediately, when we saw it, we're like, we can have Michael on the show. Because we were so excited to add your book to our shelves and extend our podcast universe to now have you here on Book of the Mouse.
Oh, thank you. Well, like I said, happy to be here and definitely nice to talk to not only two fellow Disney fans, but two fellow readers as well. So thank you.
So before we get into your book, we do like to ground our discussion like you do in Disorder about things you love about Disney. So what makes you a Disney fan?
Oh, gosh. I think because it's something that my father and my mother, but my father was kind of the bigger Disney fan, instilled in me when I was very young. And he passed on his love of Disney to me and used to tell me stories about going to see Disney movies when he was a kid. My dad just turned 89 just a few days ago, and he went to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs during its initial release back in 1930. Well, it came to New York in 1938. So he would tell me stories of going to see it at Radio City Music Hall and trying to run out of the theater when the Queen changed into the old hag. So it was something that he passed on to me. So Disney to me I always feel that connection to my childhood and also a connection to my parents as well, because then as I got older, the Disney Summer Film Festival that we've talked quite a bit about on Disorder is something that my mom would have introduced me to, and my mom took me to a lot of those double features. So I always feel that connection to them with Disney, and I think that's why so many people love Disney, whether it's the theme parks or the movies or the TV shows, because it's something that is handed down from generation to generation. It's something that everyone can share in, whether it's families together on vacation or families sitting together watching a movie that the parents saw when they were kids and they're now passing it on to their children.
I absolutely agree. Emily and I, it will come up, I'm sure a lot grew up during the Disney Renaissance. So that was when everything was coming onto VHS. So I know that my mom loved, she loved Cinderella. That's what came out when she was a kid and she saw it in theaters. So for her to then be able to pass that on physically through home media was perfect. So I think that grounds us in here really well.
So to start talking about your book, we like to start where all writing starts, with research and the writing process. So you've had an extensive career writing about Disney animation for media outlets, but how is writing a book different from writing those articles?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's much different in that, I had read a quote one time, and I'm going to paraphrase it. It's from Stephen King, and he said, writing one of his books is like taking a trip, and you need to kind of map it out, or I guess in today's world, have GPS, because you need to know where you're going. So when I was writing this book, I needed to have some sort of GPS to know where I was going to start and where I was going to end. For Drawn to Greatness, because it was about a period of time in Disney history, I knew where I was going to start and where it ended because history kind of dictated that. So I did have that GPS, but then much like a trip, you have to be able to maybe take a side road and go somewhere else that's a little unexpected and then come back on the main road. You have to be able to make a stop every now and then to, kind of refuel yourself. And then your research, that's really kind of what you pack in your suitcase. That's what you prep for before the trip. And, I think whether it is nonfiction or fiction, every writer does a tremendous amount of research before they delve into a book. And I think that is like packing your suitcase and that you have to organize yourself. I think we've all taken trips, and whether it's something that you plan, like a long-term trip, or whether it's something that's more spur of the moment, spontaneous, you still have to prepare in some way. So for me, the research for this book, I was very fortunate in that back in the 1990s, I wrote for several different magazines and was able to cover a majority of the Disney films released in the 90s when they first came out. So I got to interview the animators, directors, producers, art directors, and I'm a pack rat and I hold on to everything. So I held on to these interviews, both the cassette tape recordings that I made of them, either over the phone or in person, and I had also transcribed them as well. So I dug all of those out of my archives. I kind of had a national treasure moment when I pulled them out because I had all of these on computer disks, and I had a MacBook Pro, which obviously doesn't have a computer disk that you can slot into. So I had to buy an external computer disk, and I popped the disk in, not knowing if I was going to be able to see what was on it. And a whole page of garbled text came up. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to have to listen to all of these tapes all over again and transcribe them. And I scrolled down one page of garbled text, and there was the interview. And it was like that on every single one of them. So it was it was kind of like my national treasure moment where I felt like I unearthed these finds. But that was kind of my packing moment for the trip, where I organized all of the interviews I had done. So I put all of the movies together, whether it was Lion King or Hercules. And then I put files together, whether it was on my computer or actual files, because I found an accordion file of all of these reviews and magazine articles that I had kept from the 90s. So I organized all that as well. And once I was finished packing, I was ready to take the trip, and I had my GPS, which in my case was an outline of where I wanted to go. And, like I said, took a little turns every now and then and didn't quite follow the GPS to the letter, but it got me to the last page.
I really like that metaphor there, and definitely wanted to hone in on those interviews. Emily and I are very attuned to footnotes and things like that. We are the people who absolutely read them and read all the appendices. And I was texting Emily as I was reading it the other day at lunch. I'm like, oh my gosh, these are all his original interviews because you so kindly dated them. I'm like, he was doing this in the moment. So I'd love to hear a little more about just how it felt emotionally, maybe to revisit those interviews, and then certainly how else you supplemented your interviews with maybe some more current research.
Well, my good friend Scott Hopkins, who I host From Pencils to Pixels with, when the book came out, and he's like us, he reads the footnotes as well. So when he noticed the footnotes, he said, just looking at the dates on these footnotes, you've kind of been writing this book your whole life. And I'm like, oh, that's a good point. I've held on to these for so long. It was every single time I would bring up the transcript of an interview, or would reread one of my articles from a magazine, or would pull out an article that I read at the time. it was like a portal back in time. It was like going into a time machine, which was really great because it allowed me to set each movie as I wrote about it chronologically in what was going on at the time, and I really think that was very helpful, especially when writing about Pocahontas, because as I was writing about it, I started to look through the articles I had, and I remembered that they had this big giant premiere for Pocahontas in the summer of '95 in Central Park. Disney put on this mammoth premiere. I think at the time it was the largest gathering for a screening of a movie in history. It broke some record at the time. And I thought, well, just by going back and reliving that, I'm now going to put that in the book. So yeah, each and every one of them was like a little portal back in time for me.
So your book is also our latest publication from Theme Park Press to add to mine and Courtney's bookshelves. And every publication process is so unique, even with so many authors that have used Theme Park Press that we've talked to in our show. Everyone's journey is different. So what was your publication process, your experience, like getting this book finally from your computer to print?
Yeah, it's my first book ever. So for me, it was wonderful because I had nothing else to compare it to. I was like, yay, it's published. But the strangest thing for me was to watch it along that journey. And, so many people have said, and you hear this a lot from animators, you heard a lot from writers, that when you do something like this, it is like having a child and you watch it grow up and then go out into the world. It was very interesting for me to watch everything go from chapters that I had in separate folders on a Word document to then being on one big Word document to being submitted. And then I got the galley proofs back and it was laid out as it was going to look like in the book. That was incredible. And then there was another kind of growth spurt as well for the book when the publisher sent me the image that was going to be used on the cover. And then finally that day when the publisher said, okay, it looks like we have a date. And then one day he said, hey, click here on this link at Amazon. I think you're going to be surprised. And I clicked on the link and there it was. My book was available on Amazon, which was probably one of the most surreal moments in my life. When a family member said to me, do you know when I go and search you on Amazon, your book comes up? And I'm like, that's just strange. So for me, as a first-time writer, it definitely gave me that sense of watching something like this grow up. And now, I have a copy of the book here and I'm looking at it. And I remember back to, that was about 2 years ago now that I was just in the early stages of writing it and, just sitting down those first couple days with the blank pages and then going back and correcting things. And you think about the journey along the way. I had friends who would help me read it and proofread it and give me advice. So it is definitely like watching somebody grow up.
Yeah, I imagine when you hold it for the first time, it like you said, it's like holding a child almost. I'd love to know, though, as a freelance writer, you've certainly written a lot of things. So how was the publication for the book different than maybe the more traditional news media that you've worked with? How did that feel different for you?
I felt there was a lot more freedom here, just in terms of, I think for magazines and websites, you'll have a word count and, you really have to be careful and stay within that. Many times, when you're working with an editor on a website, they want an article to sound a certain way, or there's a certain audience that you're catering to with the article, whereas the book didn't have that. The book, there was a lot more freedom. I mean, if you have a 800-word article, you really have to use those, let's say, interview clips that you have very judiciously, and you wind up cutting down a lot of what you start out with, whereas the book, which was somewhere between 70 to 75,000 words, there was a lot more freedom. I was very much self-directed as I was writing it as well. So yeah, there was a lot more freedom here. And then, you work with the publisher as well. And he and I had conversation at the beginning, Bob McLean, the publisher, he and I had conversation at the beginning where, he had seen a lot of my writing, and he said, if you write like you do in your articles, in your blog, that's definitely the tone that I'd love to see in the book. So I was always keeping that in mind as well.
That is so interesting too, in terms of, like you said, the timeline. The book had a chance to grow up, where I'm sure with news media, you have maybe some deadlines, like some things, if you're publishing about the premiere, like you have of a movie that kind of needs to come out soon versus having the time to really mull it over and do that extra research, get some more eyes on it.
Yeah, no, for sure. A lot of times, especially back in the 90s when, I remember my first job writing, it was pre-email. So I would go to see whatever movie was out that weekend. And there was a small newspaper in Long Island called the Island Ear. It was an entertainment newspaper that was given out free in movie theaters. And I would go to see a movie over the weekend. I had 500 words to write my review. And then I would fax it to the editor on Monday morning, and the editor would scan it in his scanner into his computer. But I had, sometimes just a day to write that review, and had 500 words to get that in. So, yeah, it was beautiful to have 200 and some odd pages to work with.
So this talk of technology, I think, transitions us pretty well, because we are going to go back to the 90s and the Renaissance, and to kind of ground our discussion more, to talk about the content of your book. Could you give us a little context and how you would define the Disney Renaissance era? Like, how are these films different from films of other eras? You've talked about eras on Disorder many times. Like, we're now going to watch
the Disney Adequates.
Yes, the Adequates, the golden era.
Adequates, right.
We say the Disney Adequates now because of your podcast. What differentiates the Disney Renaissance from those other eras?
I think one big thing is story. You had a change in leadership that happened just prior to the Renaissance starting, which was Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg coming in. And they knew very little about animation, but they knew a lot about story, because where they had come from at Paramount Pictures and other studios, they knew that a screenplay had to be solid in order for a film to be solid, obviously. There was a producer years ago, I'm trying to remember his name, was back in the golden age of Hollywood, who said, like, if a screenplay stinks when it's on the page, it's not going to smell much better when it gets up to the screen. So they knew that, and they brought that sense of, we need to start with a strong story, which prior to the Renaissance, the 70s was a challenging time for Disney, and in most of the 80s as well. And they were working off of what had been in place at the studio for years, which was not so much working from a screenplay, it was more working from a storyboard. And different artists would storyboard different sections, and then those sections would be put together. And that's how they put the story together, because that's what had worked for so many years. And what this new leadership at Disney brought was this sense of, let's get a solid story first and then move on from there. I think that sense of story, coupled with a generation of animators who were really hungry to bring animation and Disney animation back. In the book, there's a quote from an interview I did with Andreas Deja, one of the animators at the time, a great legendary animator. And he said that when he started at Disney, I think it was in the 80s, the early 80s, he said they were having trouble recruiting people out of art school to come and work at Disney. And those that were there knew that there was all this talent that was just pent up and waiting for their opportunity. So when they got somebody to feed them and work with them on these stories, their talent and their artistry just kind of blossomed with it. And I think with it, they brought new ideas in terms of incorporating music into an animated film, new ideas incorporating graphics of what an animated film could look like, bringing in new technology as well. And also a lot of them brought in live action sensibilities in terms of staging an animated movie. For years, animated movies looked very flat, very one-dimensional. And even when they were working with the 2D animation, they said, we can stage our movies like a live action film and give it that live action feel. So I think that's really what separates the Renaissance, is that you had this new leadership that came in and fed all of this, creativity that was just bursting, waiting to be realized.
Absolutely. And Emily and I, as I shared, feel very fortunate to have, I guess, grown up quite literally during the Renaissance with these films. But what's been fun for me to hear on Disorder and read through your book is, you have these more vivid memories of the films and were writing reviews and interviewing at the time. So I'd really like to know more about what it was like experiencing this era as somebody who grew up with a different generation of Disney films.
I remember at the time it was a relief as a Disney fan and an animation fan when I remember that summer that The Lion King came out, and that was the first time in a long time that like everybody I knew went to see a Disney movie. Like it wasn't just me going to see it and then telling my friends about it and my cousins about it. I was in my 20s at the time. And I remember my friends going to see it. I remember family members going to see it. I remember like grandparents going to see it, and obviously bringing families as well. So it was just this huge relief and this feeling of like, thankfully everybody's seeing and loving what I've loved about animation and what I've loved about Disney so much. And then I just felt so fortunate to get to experience all of it by talking to the artists who were creating it. That was just incredible. To do these interviews months before the movie came out, to see the movie before it came out, and to kind of be, ahead of the game and to know these stories and to have these artists take the time to share these stories is really something I will never forget. And I remember at the time, in the 90s, it's when I also had this awakening of all this great writing that was out there about animation history. And there were great animation historians and writers out there who've inspired and influenced me, like John Canemaker and John Culhane and Jerry Beck, Charles Solomon and Brian Sibley. And when I would actually have an opportunity to talk to them, they were writing about kind of the classic golden age of Disney. And all of them would say, boy, if we could go back in time to the studio and just sit down and talk to the 9 old men and talk to Walt and get all of this information then, while they were in the midst of these movies like Snow White and Pinocchio, we would love that. And I thought, I'm having this opportunity to do this right now, and that was kind of the first spark, probably like 25 or so years ago, of thinking about the book. So that whole era of the 90s was just, as a Disney fan and an animation fan, a tremendous sense of relief. And as a writer, a tremendous sense of gratitude to be able to document it as well.
I truly just want to take a moment to praise how amazing all of those interviews were. I think as an avid Disney fan and avid reader, the highest praise that I can give a book is that I learned something from it. And I learned so much from this. I've seen Waking Sleeping Beauty, amazing documentary. We've talked about it on the show before. So I was like, what is this going to tell me new? And there was so much. So I just want to plug that for our listeners, that those interviews, like once I realized what was going on in the book, once I saw the first footnote, I was like, oh, I'm going to learn a lot. And I did. So thank you. I just wanted to plug that in there.
Well, thank you. That was always my goal. And as you both know, doing an interview with somebody is, it's always a game of like, okay, this is what I want them to talk about. How do I get them to talk about it without just coming out and asking the question, So you always have to put your questions together in such a way that you get them to open up. So I appreciate that. It makes me feel like I actually did that. So thank you.
You absolutely did.
And also just having that plethora of primary sources, because having done research for history, not necessarily Disney history, but you're always hoping that you had that voice from someone. And thankfully, you have taken that opportunity to talk to these people, and it is documented. And thankfully, your CD-ROM did work, that you had access to them. So it's great when we can add to the primary sources available as well, because that just tells a much more authentic story than only secondary sources, or trying to get to people, or realizing how important it is to talk about these after maybe some people have passed or moved on to other projects.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And, when I was writing the book, a lot of what I used to kind of fill in gaps were, I would go to other books on animation. So interviews that have been done in the past that have been documented in books became a resource for me. So I'm hoping that Drawn to Greatness can be a resource for somebody else down the road, and will serve as that, that document of this time.
Speaking of that time period, in your introduction, I'm going to read a quote here. This is from the last page of your introduction, second page. It says, quote, "Drawn to Greatness, Disney's animation renaissance seeks to capture a moment in time that's still somewhat in our, quote, collective rearview mirrors before it fades into the distant horizon," end quote. And I wanted to ask, that stood out to me, because why do you think it is so important to write about Disney's renaissance period now, and maybe not in another 10 or 15 years?
A lot of what I would hear, the struggles of a lot of those animation historians and writers that I had the chance to talk to in the 90s, is that, sadly, a lot of the people who made those classic Disney films that they wanted to document weren't there. So it would be a secondhand source that they'd be going to, or it'd be someone who was someone's assistant, or someone who worked with this person. And they were writing about these movies that at the time were 50, 60 years old. So even trying to find a movie review of a movie from that time back in the 90s was difficult. Today might be a little simpler. You go on Google and type it in and it comes up, or you have Wikipedia. But back then, it was 25, 30 years ago, it was true research. Like, you had to go to libraries and find a microfiche machine, or if you were lucky enough to get onto the Disney studio lot, you were able to go into the Disney archive, as many of these writers did, and they were able to find transcripts of meeting notes and whatnot, but they were, always hunting down information. And when they would find it, it was the thrill of the hunt. They found something. And I thought, this is not only something where we still have, a lot of this documented, a lot of this is easy access, but it's a time that, we all still remember. It's kind of strange to hear things like, when I think that this year will mark the 30th anniversary of The Nightmare Before Christmas, that doesn't seem possible, but it's true. But in the grand scheme of things, 30 years is really not that long. And considering the fact that, in those 30 years, we have had cable and home video and now streaming that keeps these movies going and has kept them in the public eye more so than you did back in the 90s, 80s, or 70s, when the movies came out to movie theaters every 5 to 7 years. So, I thought, while all this is kind of fresh in our memory, so to speak, it was good to kind of document this time, because it was a very important time that not only changed animation history and Disney history, but I think it also changed film history too.
When you were saying the way now streaming keeps things alive, like, we don't have the Disney Vault anymore. When you got so excited with the preview that would say, like, coming in spring of 1997, this will be re-released. Like, we don't have that anymore.
It was an event. I remember I feel like VHS tapes came out on Tuesdays, and my mom would take me to BJ's, and we'd go get the VHS tape, and it would maybe come with like a Disney Beanie Baby. It was a big deal.
Or you had to go to the Disney store, because some would only be featured or sold at the Disney store. And you would get like the extra print, or I had in our basement, our wall was just covered in like
the lithographs.
The lithographs of, you bought the VHS here, here's your picture. They were all over my playroom wall as a kid.
I'm just glad Happy Meal toys are back. because that was a big part of
Right.
it too.
In a way, it's kind of nice to look back on that, and you kind of feel like if you had Christmas every day, do you appreciate it? It's that old question, like if every day was Christmas, would you appreciate opening gifts? And back in the 90s when these movies came out every so often on VHS and went back in the vault, you did run off to the Disney store. You did run off to BJ's to get it with the latest, plush or lithograph. But man, if somebody told us all back then, someday you'll be able to just click a button on your TV remote and watch whatever Disney animated movie you want, we would have said, sign us up for that.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another.
No, kids today, I'm feeling old, but it's like, you don't know how lucky you have it. Back in my day,
it's true.
We had to rewind, all that. Now you just pause, go wherever you want. Well, where I would like to go next is to the chronological order of this. I appreciated that you did ground your readers in some of the early, pre-Renaissance but important history, like The Great Mouse Detective, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Oliver and Company all certainly showed tremendous growth in animation techniques, and did see some box office success. That's where the tide starts to turn after the failure that was The Black Cauldron. But could you help define for our listeners why The Little Mermaid is really the start of the Renaissance era?
Yeah, I think, Mermaid was the start in many ways because I think it really came out of the gate very strong in terms of its, and this isn't to put down any of the movies you just mentioned, but I think it just came out very strong out of the gate in terms of its story, in terms of its character. And I think something that really defined Little Mermaid and redefined the animated feature was the music by Howard Ashman and Alan Menken as well, who brought, this incredible Broadway sensibility to an animated movie, and suddenly, made everybody realize, this, Disney is the home of the classic animated musical. And I think Little Mermaid also became that first movie that it started to cross the line of demographics as well. That was, the first time that I can remember, I remember my cousin taking his daughter to see it. And I remember him saying to me, that's not just a great animated movie, that's a great movie. And here he was, the father taking his daughter to see this movie, and he enjoyed it. And, so often prior to Little Mermaid, parents taking their children to see a new animated movie, Disney or otherwise, was often, a chore for the parent, that they had to do this and sit through this matinee. So I think that could have probably been the biggest thing in terms of what they did, not only with the film itself, but how the film performed, and crossing over to different demographics. And then, of course, went on to get a lot of attention from critics. It made a lot of top 10 lists that year in '89, which hadn't happened to a Disney animated movie in quite some time. And then went on to win 2 Oscars for the music as well. And I believe it was the first Disney movie to win an Oscar since Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which was 1971, won for Best Visual Effects. So I think that started the reawakening of animation, not just for the core audience, but for everybody.
I wholeheartedly agree that Little Mermaid is the start of the Renaissance for those reasons, but I do often defend the amazingness that is The Great Mouse Detective and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It always catches me, like your book says, and you prove that they were successful films in their way, but I feel like when you talk to people who are like, that was one that didn't do so well, right? I'm like, no, it did.
Yeah, no, they did well. And, Jerry Beck, and I have his quote in the book, in his animated film guide, he calls Oliver and Company a dress rehearsal for what was to come. And I think you could say that of Great Mouse Detective and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Oliver and Company. And each one of them continued to build forward. Great Mouse Detective incorporated technology, incorporated computer animation pretty extensively in that Big Ben chase at the end. Who Framed Roger Rabbit allowed everybody to kind of fall in love with animation history because it was about animation history. And then, Oliver and Company kind of brought back that classic Disney feel of, the anthropomorphic animals, the well-known voices, and music as well. A lot of people forget Oliver and Company was a musical, and it incorporated that kind of top 40 music in as well. So each one of them kind of pushed the needle just a little bit further. You're right.
Yeah, and then Little Mermaid's the perfect combination of the technology, the music, and the story and character.
Yep.
So you do include other films in your book as well. And we want to know what led you to include films like The Nightmare Before Christmas, A Goofy Movie, Toy Story, James and the Giant Peach. Why are they important to talk about when discussing the Renaissance era, even though they weren't made by Disney Animation Studios?
Yeah, I thought they are part of the decade, and they're each one of them served a purpose in expanding animation, because what was great about the 90s was not only was animation growing at Disney, but it was growing at other studios and in other ways too. So The Nightmare Before Christmas, very important just in terms of, initially that was going to be released by Touchstone Pictures. So it was going to be a bit of a darker film and something new for animation. And it was also bringing back stop motion animation, which is like one of the oldest filmmaking crafts in Hollywood. It's been around since the silent era of film. And then, of course, Toy Story being the first computer animated film. I thought that was very important to discuss, because it started that relationship between Disney and Pixar, which today Disney and Pixar, it's one thing, two separate studios, but one thing, so to speak. And then, the other movies like James and the Giant Peach and A Goofy Movie, I talk about in there as well. These are two movies that are examples of things that happened so much, specifically at Disney in the 90s. There were so many movies in the 90s that were not successful in their initial run, but thanks to home video and thanks to a generation growing up with them on home video, they now have an audience today. James and the Giant Peach is a very niche audience, but when you talk to people about that movie, a lot of people are like, oh, I love that movie for different reasons. And then, of course, A Goofy Movie is just like, when you talk about that with some people, it's like talking about going to a rock concert when they discuss A Goofy Movie. They just have such fond memories of that.
Emily, you are describing Emily right now.
That is me. I was gonna say that Goofy Movie is like TikTok famous now, like having new technology and social media to let those niche audiences find each other and build their own community when maybe they're distant, far apart, but now, they can listen to each other's hearts, no matter when they're far apart.
Well done.
So it is interesting to see these different groups come in as we are in a new era of streaming and watching and using social media to connect.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting because it happened quite a bit at Disney. I'm sure it happened at other studios, but I just seem to be more attuned to it at Disney, that the list of movies that they released in the 90s that now have a tremendous audience.
Hocus Pocus is mine.
Hocus Pocus, Newsies, right? Newsies went on to have a whole life Newsies as a Broadway musical. So, it's just like one after the other of these movies that were released in the 90s. And Goofy Movie and James and the Giant Peach, I think, are two examples of that. And I thought it was very important to talk about that. And I was very lucky that when I was working on the book, a friend of mine, Greg Airbar, has a friend named Bambi Moe, who was the music producer on Goofy Movie. So he set me up with her, and I was able to interview her for the book. It wasn't an interview from the 90s. So it was so interesting to get her perspective, having worked on A Goofy Movie, and to see what it's become now. She told a story, and it's in the book, where she says, she'll be out somewhere and someone will say, what do you do? I'm a music producer. And she starts listing her credits, and then she gets to A Goofy Movie and everybody gasps and says, "Oh my God, that's my favorite movie of all time." And, she was talking to a musician who said that when he goes on auditions, he plays the songs from a Goofy movie as part of his audition. It's kind of his go-to or his good luck charm. So yeah, one of the many movies that from the 90s that audiences kind of glossed over then and is now beloved.
Well, I think I appreciate so much that you did include those because one, it is important to place all those pieces in history, and I'm sure fans like myself with Goofy movie were excited to see that in the book and find its place in history. But also as a teacher of history, it's really hard sometimes, or at least I find it hard to teach to 14 and 15-year-olds that history isn't happening in a vacuum. Just because we're studying this topic doesn't mean there's not 10,000 other things happening and informing each other at the same time. So I think this is a good way to contextualize and kind of give that deeper meaning to the Renaissance era, even though we're not just focusing on the films from Disney Animation Studios.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think everything, like you just said, when you mention other things going on, it's like a backdrop for what you're talking about.
Well, I do want to hone us into Disney feature animation because I have a deep question here. Maybe not necessarily, I'm not asking your favorite. We can get to that in a bit. But what film do you think is the peak of the Renaissance era? Not what you enjoyed most, but like if we're doing the trajectory, where does it peak and why?
Yeah, so I think my answer to this is probably the same as my favorite because personally I think that The Lion King was the peak. When we talked about The Lion King on Disorder, Andy DiGenova, one of the co-hosts, said it so well. He said, The Lion King was almost the grand promise of the films that had come before it. Little Mermaid came out and, started to bring the audience back. A couple of years later, and I feel bad, we always gloss over Rescuers Down Under, but there was Rescuers Down Under, then Beauty and the Beast, obviously nominated for the Academy Award, history making and continued to expand the audience. Aladdin with Robin Williams definitely brought in a new audience. So there was this build not only with the audience, but the build also with, these were really well-made films. These were really well-made stories, and the aspects of them, the character and the music. And I think all of that came together perfectly in its peak with The Lion King. You had such a rich story that has, messages that are just very deep, characters that are just fully realized personalities, incredible animation, the merging of technology, and music that all comes together to tell, as Andreas Deja, the animator of Scar, says, that movie tells a very human story without one human in it. And that is just incredible to think of that. And I think for me, that was the pinnacle of the Renaissance. And I think audiences were obviously ready for it because The Lion King was a tremendous blockbuster. Now, by no means do I feel, and I know a lot of people may think that, things started to go down after that with the Renaissance. And I don't think so at all. I think there were tremendous movies for the remainder of the decade and also, tremendous innovation for the remainder of the decade as well. But I think, where they just came together and fired on all cylinders is with The Lion King. And the ironic thing about The Lion King is it was made by a group of artists and animators that were kind of considered the B-list of artists because Lion King and Pocahontas were going into production at the same time. And a lot of the artists wanted to work on Pocahontas because they saw that as this is what's going to really push animation forward. This is something new for us. And they saw The Lion King as, we've kind of been down this road before with The Jungle Book and with Bambi. So what that meant was a lot of the top tier animators went over to work on Pocahontas, and a lot of the newer animators who were coming up were promoted to work on Lion King. And, a lot of the folks that worked with those younger animators, the producers and the directors, of the movie said that, they were just really hungry for it, and it came across in the film as well.
So with Lion King being the peak, in your book, the era ends with The Emperor's New Groove. So we do have that range of films in between. But can you explain for our listeners why The Emperor's New Groove is the end of that era, and why not Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, who came out not too long after Emperor's New Groove?
No, yeah, that's a great point. I include The Emperor's New Groove in there because technically the Renaissance ends with Tarzan in '99. However, the following year, you had Fantasia 2000 and The Emperor's New Groove, two movies that were in production for almost the entire length of the Renaissance. Fantasia 2000, I think, started production in like 92 or 93. And then Emperor's New Groove started as Kingdom of the Sun right after The Lion King in the mid 90s. So I feel like they kind of were touched in many ways by what was going on in the Renaissance. And I think where we got to as we headed into the 2000s was, a lot of other studios started to, join in with animated features as well. So kind of that uniqueness that we saw when Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin came out, they weren't the only game in town. There were other animated features that were coming out sometimes within the same month, sometimes within the same day. So a lot of other studios were also throwing their hats into the ring, and rightly so, because they saw that, what Disney was doing was telling a good story, just telling it in animation, and they wanted to do the same. And a lot of these other studios had tremendous success with that. I think also, audience taste starts to change as well, and we see that happen through the years. And audiences who grew up on the Disney animated musicals and fairy tales and fables were kind of asking, what else is out there? What's new? What else could we do? And I think Disney was trying newer things. Like Atlantis, I think was, I believe it's the producer, Don Hahn, said they wanted to make a movie that felt like it was made in Adventureland and Disneyland, and Lilo and Stitch, another, kind of game changer in that a much smaller movie. The graphics were much different with Lilo and Stitch. So, I think you had Disney trying some new things and breaking away from the musical and breaking away from a certain model or paradigm. And I think that just the change at the studio. And then I think also, other animated movies being out there, the era just kind of ended. It's interesting when you look back at different times, and this because, we were just talking about history. There are just times in history that are from one time to another. The era just starts and it begins. And for whatever reason, whether it's in terms of technology, whether it's in terms of society, people change and things just move on or move into a new phase. And I think that's what happened with the Renaissance as well.
Well, we feel very fortunate to have experienced all of those. We got your favorite and the peak, but I'd like to know if there's one you consider maybe the most underrated within that time frame.
The underrated of the Renaissance time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, gosh. For me, it's probably The Rescuers Down Under. We were just talking about how that gets so unfairly overlooked. That is a great movie. It is a great adventure story. It's got absolutely beautiful animation, especially the opening sequence with the flight of Marahute the eagle, animated by the one and only Glenn Keane, who's a legend at Disney and a legend in animation. And it's a great sequel, too. It's true to the original Rescuers. Bernard and Bianca are back, and they're very much the characters that they were in the first movie. So it feels very much a part of that universe, and just an all-around really entertaining film that just gets better each time I see it. It unfortunately had the timing to open against Home Alone, in 1990. And, the family audience that holiday season wanted to go see Home Alone and wanted to go see it multiple times rather than go to see The Rescuers Down Under. And the Disney studio kind of reaction to that was to kind of move on to their next project. And unfortunately, they pulled all of their marketing at the time for the movie. So without any commercials or print ads or anything out there, The Rescuers Down Under just kind of withered away. But thankfully, so many have discovered it since, because when you mention The Rescuers Down Under to somebody, they usually have that, that same experience I had, which is, oh, what a great movie. How underrated.
I feel like people that was a great pick, because people forget that one. Like, if you were to ask people to name the Renaissance films in order, I feel people just go right from Little Mermaid to Beauty and the Beast. And just like, oh yeah, that one.
Yep.
Although interestingly, I think, Courtney, maybe this was for you too, growing up during the Renaissance, I think I saw Rescuers Down Under first, and then the original Rescuers Down Under.
I did not see, I'm ashamed to admit this, I did not see Rescuers Down Under till college when it was on Netflix, because I don't know, we just, my mom didn't buy that VHS. And so maybe I'm talking about myself when I say that we went from Little Mermaid to Beauty and the Beast. So I did not have the affinity for that, but I have enjoyed it in revisiting or discovering it, I guess, since I don't know how that happened, because we owned all the VHS tapes, but apparently not that one.
I think your story is the story of many people when it comes to this time frame. Yeah, but thankfully it's getting rediscovered now.
Or the shock of people when they realize that was the first Disney animated sequel, because we think of all the like direct to VHS sequels, like all these movies had sequels. I'm like, no, but that's like the actual first sequel. And it's kind of funny to think that like that would be the first one. Again, people growing up in I think our generations are Renaissance babies, I guess, specifically, because we would have to look back another 20 years to The Rescuers, that maybe that connection doesn't hit either.
We were getting Return of Jafar, Aladdin and the King of Thieves, my favorite, Beauty and the Beast, Enchanted Christmas. It was like every year you got a Renaissance movie and a direct to VHS sequel. Good times.
Yeah, you were spending all your time at the Disney store getting those lithographs.
Exactly.
Actually, no. So to take us towards the end of your book, thinking about where we are now in Disney animation, looking towards the future, after we have Atlantis, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, maybe we could argue we're in like a Disney Adequates Part 2. We know how you and Disorder feel about Home on the Range and Bolts. But then we get these films that are now the powerhouse films of today, like Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Encanto. We have Raya and the Last Dragon. We now have Strange World is the newest film. Where do you see Disney animation going now since the Renaissance era?
That's a great question. I think we're kind of in I think we almost take kind of a second Renaissance, so to speak. And I would say Frozen was probably the peak of that. If Lion King, for me, was the peak of the Renaissance in the 90s, I feel like Frozen, once again, I think really brought everybody back and brought different demographics back to animation. And I think, even more so than it was in the 90s, I think, the opportunities for Disney animation going forward are even more wide open now, because I think there's more audience acceptance of animation than there was back in the late 80s and early 90s. Because, as much as I talk about Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin growing their audience, everybody still wasn't there at that time. It was still very much, seen as a family film, which Disney movies still are. But I feel like there's such a larger audience now in many ways. I think you have people from different ages, different demographics watching Disney animated movies. I think you also have a different mindset of different generations now, and we were just talking about this on Disorder in terms of, at one time you kind of felt like you went to see the Disney movies when you were a kid and you outgrew that at maybe age 10 or 11. And then maybe you went to see the movies again if you had kids. But there wasn't this feeling of I'm going to continue watching Disney movies through my teens, through college, through my 20s, into my 30s and on. And Disney, these animated movies are a part of my life. And there is that feeling now and that mindset now, which I think continues to open up the possibilities. And I think Disney Plus and streaming is going to do that as well, because I think where we are very fortunate now in terms of every Disney animated movie or almost every Disney animated movie in the library is on there. If a movie does not do well at the box office, it has another chance on Disney Plus, and not that long after. 25, 30 years ago, if an animated movie didn't do well at the box office, it waited 6 to 8 months and came out on VHS. And then a year later, it was on cable, and then maybe was shown on Disney Channel or a few other places. But now, if the movie doesn't do well in the theaters, 45 days later, it's going to be on Disney Plus. And then maybe that will give everybody an opportunity to discover it or rediscover it, and it will always be there. So for me, I think opportunities are even bigger for what animation can do. And I think in terms of story, because there's more acceptance of it, there's probably more opportunity, definitely with technology because of computer animation. But I think in terms of story, because audiences are more receptive to it, there's hopefully, I think, more opportunity to go into new and exciting stories as well.
It sounds like we have Drawn to Greatness Part 2 ahead of us, which is so exciting.
I would love to write that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking us through all of this wonderful history, the writing process. As I'm sure our listeners can tell, we enjoyed the book so much. But as we wrap up, we have 2 questions that we always ask our authors that we interview. So our first is that as a book podcast, we are always looking to expand our Disney knowledge and add to our own bookshelf. So do you have a favorite Disney book or books on your shelf that you would want to recommend to us and our listeners as well?
Oh gosh, I have quite a few.
Go right ahead.
So just in terms of Disney and all animation, one of the first books I ever read was a book called Of Mice and Magic by Leonard Maltin, and it is about the history of animation from the silent days up until then. It was the late 70s, and Disney is included in there as well. In terms of Disney books on Walt Disney himself, there is Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. And to learn a lot about Disney animation, there is a book by John Canemaker called The 9 Old Men, Walt Disney's Animators and the Art of Animation. That's by a gentleman named John Canemaker. And he has written several different books on Disney animation, from Paper Dreams, which was all about storyboard artists, to Before the Animation Begins, which is about the conceptual artists as well. So those are just a few off of my bookshelf.
Thank you so much for those recommendations. I know Courtney and I are constantly, we write down these titles. They will make it on here eventually. That's why we love this podcast so much, because there is actually so many books out there to expand our knowledge. But our final question we always ask is, what advice do you have for aspiring writers, especially since this is your first book?
Yeah, I think, the advice that I'm going to give is probably going to sound like a broken record from other authors that you've probably had on here before, or that you've seen or you've heard interviews from. One thing is, I think if you're going to write, you should be reading. Years ago, Steven Spielberg was accepting an honorary Oscar, and he said that, he wanted to encourage younger people to read because he wanted to see better stories in Hollywood. And he said a generation of readers will kind of give birth to a generation of writers as well. So I think read as much as you can, and read things that are out of your comfort zone. So if you're writing nonfiction, read fiction. If you're writing fiction and you want to write horror, read another genre. Because I think you will take bits and pieces of everything, and it's almost like the reader's buffet. You take a little bit of everything and you make it your own as a writer. And the other thing I would say is write as much as you can. I think like anything else that we do in life, the more that we do it, the more we get comfortable with it, and the more it becomes a part of us. So even if you just write a little bit each day, a couple of sentences, a paragraph, if it's all you can get in, that's fine. If it's journaling, whatever it might be, just jotting down some thoughts, I think is really important just to write every day.
I love that idea of switching genres because that is something that we love to do here on the podcast. So thank you for that wealth of advice.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't mind, we'll let our listeners know where we're going, and where I'm going with that is that we're switching genres. We do want to remind our listeners of our recent appearance together on the Synergy Loves Company podcast. The host Eric invited us to discuss banned books and their connections to Disney films. You can certainly find that episode wherever you're listening to ours, and we enjoyed chatting with Eric so much that we've invited him to join us next month for our February selection as a guest reader, and we are diving into the world of fiction. So we are discussing Natalie Babbitt's 1975 novel Tuck Everlasting, which Disney turned into a live-action film in 2005. If you are unfamiliar with that story, I have a brief description of the book here. Quote, "What if you could live forever? Is eternal life a blessing or a curse? That is what young Winnie Foster must decide when she discovers a spring on her family's property whose waters grant immortality. Members of the Tuck family, having drunk from the spring, tell Winnie of their experiences watching life go by and never growing older. But then Winnie must decide whether or not to keep the Tuck secret and whether or not to join them on their never-ending journey." End quote. So excited to switch it up per Michael's recommendation here. But in the meantime, you can keep up with Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse, or email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. Please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. If you want to keep up with me, Courtney, I am on Instagram at Great Guthsby, or on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle, at Emily_McD. And Michael, where can our listeners connect with you, and where is the best place to buy your book?
So if you want to connect with me, I'm also out there on Twitter at MLyonsFL. And if you want to keep up with anything and everything I have going on, articles that I've written or latest episodes of the podcast, you can head over to my website, which is Words from Lyons, Lyons. That's wordsfromlyons.com. You can buy the book there on my website. If you buy it on my website, I am selling them signed and personalized. And the book is also available on Amazon as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. We'll be sure to include links to all of those in our show notes. But also, as our guest of honor, you have the distinct honor of closing our episode with the closing quote. So I cannot wait to hear what you have selected for us.
Yeah, I'm excited to share this. So this is actually a quote from the book, from my book, and it is from a gentleman named Don Hahn, who produced a number of successful films during the animation Renaissance, most notably Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And this quote is actually from an interview that Don did for a documentary for Walt Disney Home Video for the 10th anniversary of The Lion King. And he was asked, why do you think The Lion King was such a big hit? Looking back on it then 10 years later, why do you think The Lion King was such a big hit? And Don said, no one, I don't care who they are or what they say, sets out to make a worldwide event or something that influences culture. In fact, if you set out to do those things, you'd probably fail. All we have, as one of the great Disney animators, Eric Larson, once said, is sincerity. It's our gift to the audience. So when you try to put that across, people feel that. And what I've always loved about that quote is I think it really speaks to The Lion King. I really think it speaks to the movies that were made during the Renaissance and so much of what Disney does. They put so much sincerity into everything. But I think it's also a quote that we can take into our own lives in what we do in our professional life and our personal life. You know, anytime you put heart and sincerity into something, people react to that. So they respond to that. And I always think of this quote as being very much about The Lion King, but also something that we can take with us each and every day. So I'm happy to share it.
Thank you. And we are sincerely grateful for you joining us today. And again, thank you for all of the knowledge that you've imparted and the great answers and discussion here.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
And Michael, we look forward to continue to hear from you on Disorder Podcast and from Pencils to Pixels, the Animation Celebration podcast as well.
The Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.